Hi everybody, I'm Girl Writes What, and I just wanted to give a shout out to the Redditor who posted my video on a large subreddit and got me, I think, at like 1,000 new subscribers in the course of a day. Uh, Thanks a bunch for that, and I wanted to welcome all of you newcomers. I'm a little bit humbled by the response that I've gotten, and I really do appreciate the words of support. Uh, you might notice as well that today all my cabinet doors and all my drawers are closed. So hopefully nobody's OCD will be triggered while they're listening to this video. And I also want to say that I accept the kitchen jokes with good nature, even though this is really the only place in my house where the lighting is decent and there's room for me to do this. So anyhow, welcome to all the newcomers. Thanks for the support, and let's just get started here. So I had some criticisms about how simplistic my feminism and the disposable male video was. That the whole concept of the lifeboats and everything is just very exaggerated, and when does that ever happen? And couldn't I provide some concrete examples of this dynamic if you know, and more nuanced, if this actually really exists? And I'm hoping that this video will help to demonstrate how that mentality, women and children first, men into the trash, plays out in our views of violence, and especially in our views of gendered violence. So here goes. Okay, so the other day I came across a comment from a feminist that went something like this. Men and women have different issues. Men have to solve fairness in child custody, family maintenance, and stuff like that. Women have the problem of systemic gendered violence directed at them on a global scale. Now, that sounds really serious and really scary. But on the other hand, when I think about systemic gendered violence and I look at the real world and what goes on in it, it's becoming more and more apparent to me that systemic gendered violence is not a female problem. When we look at domestic violence, the quintessential example of what's presented to us as gendered violence against women, well, any well-informed MRA and many an egalitarian could tell you that intimate partner violence is perpetrated roughly equally between genders, and the causal factors tend to be identical no matter what the gender of the perpetrator is, and that men and women suffer that violence in roughly equal numbers. In fact, the only gendered aspects of intimate partner violence seem to be in report rates and in society's response to that violence. Women are much more likely to report being abused than men. Men are more likely to be arrested, even if they weren't the physically violent partner. State-funded domestic violence victim services overwhelmingly serve female victims, and even our federal legislation explicitly excludes male victims from many of its protections and benefits. Hell, some domestic violence shelters will not shelter children of battered women if those children are male and over 16. So looking at that, it seems to me as if women feel they should not have to put up with being physically abused by their partners, and society agrees with them. And it also seems to me like men feel like they do have to put up with being abused by their partners, and society agrees with them too. The social and political consensus appears to be that domestic violence against women is intolerable, while domestic violence against men is, well, who cares? And boys, our society fails them too. One only has to look at the recent Verizon ad on domestic violence to see every single disgusting stereotype we hold as a society distilled into a single piece of distorted propaganda. The father is the monster because only men are abusers, don't you know? Mother and daughter are terrified victims. The son is not a victim, but a monster in the making. We're not supposed to care about the trauma he suffers, other than that it might lead him to be an abuser of women and girls in the future. He's not a victim. He's a potential future perpetrator. His suffering means nothing to us other than the fact that his suffering might lead him to victimize others. And you might say, well, what about sexual violence? the common wisdom is that rape is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men on women. But one huge cross-cultural study on sexual coercion in relationships found, again, roughly equal numbers of victims and perpetrators between genders within heterosexual relationships. Men were just as likely to be forced or verbally coerced into sexual intercourse by their partners, female partners, as women were by their male partners. Moreover, the CDC's most recent report on sexual victimization, if you go to the bother of amalgamating all the categories into non-consensual sexual intercourse perpetrated on either men or women, even this report shows parity in the number of male and female previous year victims. Yet how aware are we as a society of sexual violence against men? And how aware are we or willing to face the problem of sexual violence against boys? Sexual violence and exploitation of underage males by adult women is almost never characterized as rape in the media. The preferred language titillates rather than evoking outrage. Teacher seduces male student. Forbidden love. Teacher's dirty little secret fling. Hot for teacher. It actually seems to me that the only way a boy will even be seen as a real victim within the public consciousness is if the perpetrator is an adult male. At which point, pervasive and lingering homophobia overrides our view of the kinds of sexual violence against males that are acceptable in our culture. And while we're justifiably appalled at the idea of a barely pubescent girl married off to an adult man in Afghanistan, how aware are we as a society that adolescent and pre-adolescent boys are bought and sold there, often in order to support female family members, when the authorities, even in that country, choose to look the other way? When we look at some real numbers, we find that sexual victimization of children is not really a gendered problem. Victims are both male and female. Perpetrators are also male and female, with larger percentages of female perpetrators coming to light all the time, as we start asking less biased questions in surveys. Yet at the same time, one recent study done by a children's charity in the UK showed that 80% of children sexually abused by a woman, when they disclosed, they were not believed by the first person they told. Even though in the majority of those cases, the first people they told were people whose job it is to keep kids safe: police officers, crisis lines, counselors, or teachers. And adult men who report sexual victimization by women, even in informal settings, the first question asked is usually, well, was she hot? Followed by something along the lines of, which wish I could get raped by some hot chick. It seems clear to me that interpersonal violence, sexual or otherwise, perpetrated against women and girls is strongly condemned, both by society and the system, while that perpetrated against men and boys is largely minimized or ignored. Now let's look at other kinds of violence. Stranger violence, like muggings, stranger assaults, random homicides, and state violence. Here the statistics clearly show that men are overwhelmingly the victims, the majority victims of assault, homicide, war violence, and state violence against its citizens. The overwhelming majority of mugging victims or victims of random violence and murder are males, as are the vast majority of those unjustly incarcerated as political prisoners by totalitarian regimes, those who are beaten, killed, and arrested during times of political upheaval, those who are forcibly conscripted as children in the Third World, displaced people who don't survive long enough to make it to the refugee camps are almost always male, and even those whose genitals are mutilated due to cultural norms globally are overwhelmingly male. At the same time, how many times have we all heard on Remembrance Day or Memorial Day of the brave servicemen and women who made the ultimate sacrifice? World War I saw 10 million male soldiers killed on all sides, and not a single female soldier killed. That there were women killed during World War I isn't something that anyone's going to debate. Of course there were. But those women dying, them making the ultimate sacrifice, was not an expectation placed on them. It was something to be avoided if possible. They weren't involved in the war effort as combat soldiers, whose role was to die for their country. The women who died during wartime were unintended casualties, while the men who died were fulfilling their assigned role. Dying in war is a tragedy when it happens to women, and simply the way things are when it happens to men. And even looking at genital mutilation, at a time when there are global efforts to end female genital mutilation in places where it's still performed, there's a huge program on the part of the World Health Organization to mutilate baby boys in Africa for the betterment of African societies. This is a sacrifice not only expected of those boys, it's demanded of them, and it's a violence against infant boys that is just par for the course when equivalent violence toward females is abhorred. And I think one of the most telling examples of what I'm talking about here that's very recent is the shitstorm in the media that went down regarding the Egyptian woman in the blue bra. For those few, maybe 10 people on Earth who are unaware of what went down, the headlines went something like this: female protesters stripped and beaten by Egyptian police. Now, watching the video, all I can see is a woman getting the same beatdown as any protester would get in that part of the world, the same beatdown a man was getting right beside her, and whose garment fell open as they were dragging her away. In fact, as soon as her garment fell open, police moved to cover her back up, and one of the officers pushed another officer away to protect her. This incident led to the UN expressing concerns that Egyptian police were targeting female protesters. What? It was one woman. How does that equate to targeting women? Moreover, if they weren't targeting women before this incident, then who were they targeting during the protests up until that point, during the countless beatings, killings, and arrests that occurred in the months leading up to this incident? The incident also spurred unprecedented protests by Egyptian women who marched the streets chanting slogans. Let's think about that for just one moment. While these protests are admirable in their way, because it's always good to see women as well as men standing up and fighting against tyranny, how many Egyptian men had been beaten, killed, and jailed by that point, while these women remained silent at home? And yet, all it took was a single goddamn woman in a blue bra for them to be spurred to action? Where were they when it was men suffering for the political freedom of all Egyptians? But when you think about the words they chanted as they marched down the street, that answers my question right there, as honestly as can be. Drag me, strip me, my brother's blood will cover me. It's right there. It's men's place to inflict violence and to absorb it on behalf of society and of women. A single female victim of state violence will lead the women of Egypt to rise up and pledge their brothers' lives, not their own, to avenging that wrong. And yet it is women who suffer systemic gendered violence across the globe? This cognitive dissonance on the part of both feminists and larger society is just incomprehensible to me. Systemic gendered violence pertains to violence against a specific gender that is aided, enabled, endorsed, accepted, normalized, or required by the socio-political system in which it occurs. There's nothing gendered about interpersonal violence, which is the kind of violence women are most likely to suffer. Even sexual violence, since men and boys suffer this type of violence in roughly equal numbers. Moreover, there's nothing systemic in that interpersonal violence against women, since all of society believes it's a serious social problem in need of solutions. But violence against men, in any form, that's both gendered in that many forms of violence affect men in vastly disproportionate numbers to the levels that they affect women. And it's absolutely systemic in that the system sees the absorption of violence by men as beneficial, no big deal, even a requirement, and enables and perpetuates it by minimizing, glorifying, or ignoring it. According to Hillary Clinton, one of the most prominent feminists out there, strike a woman and you strike all of society. And as I say, strike a man and it's business as usual. That's the very definition of systemic gendered violence. Strike a man and it's business as usual. And the very fact that feminists can see systemic gendered violence as a problem women suffer when they don't, and a problem men don't suffer when they obviously do, this just tells you a lot about their ideas of male and female roles, how equality is supposed to work, and really where the motivation for a great deal of their advocacy seems to lie. And it lies right in line with patriarchy. Protect the women at all costs. I've often said that feminists, male or female, are the very people who are most at the mercy of their evolutionary instincts. And really, how can it be otherwise when one can look at all of the facts and deny all of that objective reality in favor of what feels right? Protect the women. Anyhow, that's all I have to say about that. I hope that it sheds a little bit of light on the women and children first, male disposability dynamic that I was talking about in my Feminism and the Disposable Male video, and how feminism really plays into the women and children first, that they really could see a single woman getting the same beatdown as thousands of men, as targeting women, and just something to be abhorred. That's not equality. That's not equality by a long shot, and and frankly, it's just silly. It's just silly. So I guess I'm gonna maybe tidy up in my kitchen a little bit, and I'm just gonna thank the dog and my children for being quiet while I did this video. So I guess I'll see you guys all later. Thanks for listening.